So you've all been challenged. You're all working on the international level. I think Catherine has brilliantly laid out the perception that Canada has today and the responsibility for leadership on a global issue. So I'm going to ask, I'm not going to point fingers, but I'm going to ask for 2 or 3 people to stand up and just share your perceptions on this, and just if you give you time to think about this. One way of thinking about climate change, and with all the complexities we've heard, is one way of thinking about it is bringing down greenhouse gas emissions. So the mitigation side of that, and that is a challenge for the energy sector. So everything related to energy, how do you move from fossil fuel intensive? How do you get countries away from coal? What does that mean in terms of pricing for electricity, accessibility of electricity? So that's on the mitigation side. And then on the adaptation side, as Catherine has spelled out, I mean, the simplest way is water. So if you think about those 2 things, the most immediate manifestation of climate impacts is on extreme drought or extreme flooding. There's all sorts of others, but that's a very stylized way of looking at it. And I think Catherine has said we're seeing now a surge in what are being called climate refugees. We're seeing impacts in developing countries in the agricultural sector, where because of changing climatic conditions. So these links between the climate agenda and the development agenda are absolutely direct, and they're becoming more urgent every day. And the science is no longer the science has been settled on this 20 years ago. So the question now is this leadership issue, and the other thing, and then I'll ask a couple questions just to say that at my institute, we're honoring Maurice Strong. So I was very pleased. He was, that Canada was not only one of the leaders, Canada was viewed as the leader in the international environmental agenda and the development agenda. So in addition to the 3 conventions that Catherine has reminded us of, the Montreal Protocol, when it was signed in 1987, that was shaped by scientists from Environment Canada. Environment Canada, people came from around the world here to Gatineau, to Hull, to meet with scientists, to figure out how Environment Canada structured their work, how do we support data and evidence. And so the tradition of Canada in outstanding leadership is not a proportion of our contribution of 2% of GHG emissions to the global climate. It's leadership by definition means do something more than what your expectations are. That's what leadership means. So within that, I'll just ask a couple of questions to start the conversation. And it's Catherine's point about this question of additionality. And where this relates then to is the perception that the climate finance, which has been segmented at $100 billion a year, is going to take away from the priorities related to poverty alleviation, to community education, to nutrition. So this question of additionality is important both in terms of is it new, but also then the politics of it, is it taking away from another agenda? So Peter, I wonder within that, my first question is, if you could just amplify on Catherine's question of that, and then the second one I have is that you said that it was unclear whether or not that $1.2 billion had yet to be implemented and where it was going and what it was doing. So did you get a sense, it's probably an unfair question on my sense, did you get a sense that the climate finance work of the $1.2 billion in the fast track, is that any different from money that Canada's put into the World Bank or the IDB or the Asian Development Bank in other areas, in childhood health or on nutrition or other areas? Did it seem that that was sort of in any way looked more problematic or about the same?
I guess, first of all, in terms of the question of additionality, we considered, when we were going through the audit process, we considered looking at that question of whether Canada's funds could be clearly identified as new and additional. And what we ran into was that there were not clear criteria that we could apply that were clearly accepted internationally. And that meant that as auditors, we don't have a basis for making that judgment in the case of the Canadian context. In the international context, that probably becomes even more problematic because of the flows of money between countries and because of the flows into multilateral banks and into other sources. It's very important that be sorted out, and there have been some discussions between national audit offices about how some of these challenges might be addressed in terms of basically seeing where does the money go and what happens to it. Those discussions haven't progressed very far yet, but I think that there clearly is a role for that kind of questioning and the need for that kind of expertise to be applied in this case. Your second sort of general question was about where the money was going and whether the climate financing was being managed differently from the other development funds that Canada has provided. I guess the short answer is yes. In many cases, we've seen the creation of dedicated funds. So you have a fund that has Canada's name on it with the Asian Development Bank, for example, and it has a pot of money that it is then being managed by the Asian Development Bank to fund projects that meet the criteria set up under that particular fund. We didn't do the comparison to see more generally whether the issues associated with development funds apply to this particular fund or not. We were limited in terms of how far we could go because we're not the auditors of the Asian Development Bank in this case, nor are we the auditors of the World Bank.
Potvin, est-ce que vous voulez commenter des questions additionnelles? Est-ce qu'il y a des choses avez-vous un point de vue si on peut accélérer les détails de ces questions? Parce que je pense évidemment il y a beaucoup de travail à niveau international, des questions d'additionnalité, et ça c'est maintenant pour 20 années.
Je pense que s'il n'y a pas des critères acceptés au niveau international, ça pourrait devenir quelque chose de très intéressant si on pense à une contribution positive à Paris où le Canada essaierait de dire « OK, on est un nouveau Canada, on suppose peut-être qu'on pourrait être un nouveau Canada à Paris. » Et une des choses pour démontrer qu'on est ce nouveau Canada, c'est de dire « Bon, nous, on a regardé, on a donné de l'argent, mais on veut être sûr pour nous et pour les autres que c'est additionnel. » Et il pourrait avoir une réflexion de fait et d'amorcer là-dessus. Moi, je connais RED, qui est Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, et la Norvège a initié quelque chose qu'on appelle le RED Partnership. Alors, RED Partnership, c'est les pays, c'est finalement un grand site Internet où les pays qui donnent disent, ben moi j'ai donné tant à RED, ici et là les pays qui reçoivent disent, ben moi j'ai reçu ça. Donc, c'est comme un site Internet ouvert et volontaire, mais ça a quand même grandi et ça permet une certaine discussion autour de ces engagements-là. Alors, ça serait quelque chose de très intéressant. Si le Canada l'a fait pour vrai, ça ne doit pas être menaçant, parce qu'on va pouvoir dire avec ça, on est bon. Donc, ce n'est pas quelque chose où on attaque le Canada dans un point faible. Au contraire, on dit, le Canada, tu dis que tu es bon, ben écoute, alors, essaie de travailler sur des critères pour démontrer qu'on l'a fait, mais aussi pour que d'autres pays, comme le Canada, démontrent qu'ils l'ont fait. Et ça serait certainement un geste qui aiderait à faire croître de nouveau cette confiance qui est défaillante actuellement.
So, please, yeah, why don't you get us going? Yeah, thank you.
Est-ce que ça marche? Oui. Hi, my name is Faris Ahmed. I work for USC Canada. Thanks for that presentation, which is both alarming and hopeful. I'm trying to find a bridge between the alarm and the hope. And I keep reminding myself of the things we've heard over the week about this idea that when we talk about complex challenges that are in the SDGs, the act of setting the goals, realizing them, implementing them, all have to do with a negotiation. We heard the word compact at the public forum. C'est vraiment un contrat social entre les peuples et l'État. And on that note, I'd love to hear your thoughts on for this to lead to good results, you really need strong national governance structures, both at the national, even at the subnational level. You need strong civil society, and you need all the actors to work together. Just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
And so perhaps maybe, and maybe within that, I had colleagues that were in Jamaica last week, and they met with the Jamaican government. So now the Prime Minister's office in Jamaica has set up a special unit to look at SDG coordination for the implementation at the national level. So this is going to be a hugely complicated issue, but countries are looking at this now, so saying it's a given now that the SDGs will be adopted in September. They're universally applicable, meaning that this applies not only to Canada's ODA, but it applies to our own performance in minimal health standards, educational standards, housing standards, nutritional standards, poverty levels, and Canada, United States, Europe will all be required to look at this. So Canada has had, Peter mentioned it at the beginning, Canada has had something called the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. In addition, Quebec, the province of Quebec has had one, the province of Manitoba has had one. Maybe you could just say what have you found with that? And then maybe from that, Catherine, to how do you see the links, I guess the bigger question, how do you see the links between your description of Canada's leadership on the climate file to date, and also where do you see the role of the SDGs in this?
I guess I would say that in sort of putting the SDGs next to the federal sustainable development strategies and sort of seeing what the links are there, clearly the current federal sustainable development strategy is very heavily focused on the environmental piece of sustainable development. It gives relatively little, pays relatively little attention to the social and economic components, and that as a consequence, it's the kinds of indicators, the kinds of goals that are being set are, I guess, just a subset of the kinds of issues that are being covered by the sustainable development strategies. We've seen in our work on the federal sustainable development strategy that even with that subset, that there are significant challenges in terms of setting clear targets, having indicators that clearly relate to those targets, having good measurement systems for those indicators, having good reporting systems that can then provide decision makers, policy makers with timely information, timely and reliable information about what's actually going on.
Ben, pour moi, les changements climatiques, c'est à la limite principalement c'est presque plus économique qu'environnemental. Quand j'étais négociatrice pour le Panama, les négociateurs d'Amérique latine ont travaillé beaucoup ensemble. Puis on s'efforçait toujours d'enlever tout ce qu'il y avait de vert dans les discours quand on allait rencontrer nos ministres. Hein? On essayait de minimiser au maximum tout ce qu'il y avait à voir avec l'environnement. On essayait de leur faire comprendre là, que c'est vraiment un agenda économique. C'est l'hégémonie d'une économie basée sur des combustibles fossiles versus une économie où l'énergie provient de sources renouvelables ou basses en carbone. Donc, ce qu'il faut, c'est faire un changement profond parce qu'on a basé notre économie sur une ressource énergétique qui n'est pas renouvelable et qui n'est pas viable. Moi, je préfère ça à durable. Donc, dans le rapport qu'on a écrit avec les chercheurs du Canada pour faire notre plan d'action climatique, nous, on dit, ben, les changements climatiques, c'est le symptôme le plus aigu d'un développement qui n'est pas durable. Et je vais quand même partager avec vous une anecdote parce que ça nous a beaucoup bouleversés. On est allé rencontrer nos collègues d'Environnement Canada à l'automne pour leur dire ce qu'on faisait, qu'on était en train d'écrire un plan d'action climatique pour le Canada, parce qu'on ne voulait pas les surprendre, parce qu'on n'est pas dans l'opposition. Nous, on est plutôt, essayons donc de travailler tout le monde ensemble. Et quand on leur a dit ça, que pour nous, les changements climatiques, là on parle de directeurs Environnement Canada, là, plusieurs directeurs Environnement Canada, on leur a dit, on pense, nous les chercheurs, que les changements climatiques, c'est le symptôme d'un développement qui n'est pas durable. Il y en a un qui nous a répondu, « Oh yes, you think so. I never saw it that way. » Alors, vraiment, je pense qu'on a du travail à faire parce qu'il faut vraiment que ces deux agendas-là se rencontrent.
Is this working?
Yes.
I just got getting near enough to it. I wanted to make a comment. Sorry, I should introduce myself because that's part of the context of my comment. My name is John Sinclair. I currently work with an advocacy group called the McLeod Group here in Canada. But my background is somebody who worked in the World Bank, included in the Canadian ED's office, and also in CEDA for many, many years. So I'm drawing upon that piece of expertise rather than my current advocacy role. What I wanted to do was sort of get back to this question of this intriguing thing, but critically important thing called additionality. Because, you know, I know that inside the realities of the way international organizations and bilateral donors like Canada handle their money, we have a little problem that, as our colleague from the Auditor General's office is saying, that large parts of this money is not really tagged in any specific way. And so, this is my personal sense, politically we have to say that there will only be additionality if there's integrity in those who are saying it is additional. I mean, it sounds as if I'm saying, well, you can never solve the problem. But I mean, ultimately, when we talked about the example of the Norwegians are very proud to show the additionality is additional. They're not trying to sort of fuzz the environment around these issues so that you're not quite sure what is what. I mean, let's be very clear. I mean, my assumption is when we talk about loans given to international organizations like the IFC, for many, many years, Canada has abandoned using its ODA for loans as a matter of principle because we said this creates indebtedness. In fact, I seem to remember, if I go back far enough, an Auditor General's report back in the 1980s, or 70s maybe it was, told CEDA it could stop, it was not allowed to use loans any longer, which it did in the past, because this was a fraud. This was not real money, this was sort of money just borrowed from somewhere in the government system. It was not an actual true contribution. That's a little larger piece of context we should be reminding ourselves of. But, so probably, you could say that the loans we give to the IFC are additional from the point of view of some larger contribution from Canada. But it was not a contribution from us as a donor. It was a contribution from us as a country able to borrow at 0.1% or 0.2%, whatever they pay us for our money, which has a very cheap money. So these were probably profit-making loans in some sense, as you could say, to the government, because it's probably charging the IFC 1%, let's say, and that money will eventually come back to Canada. So we have to be very careful how we handle these concepts. And ultimately, that's why I'm saying we have to go back to this idea that this is something about how transparent we are as a country, how transparent our government is, because there is no magic bookkeeping, accounting rule which will provide the answer really to the question we're talking about. And when that money gets to the IFC, it's even worse. Not worse in the sense they run away with the money and go on holiday somewhere in the world with it, though that may be something some people may think given their travel schedules, but that this is really something which in their accounting system is just blended in with money from France and Germany, from money they borrow in the New York money market. These are very, very complex and messy realities. So for me, additionality is not an issue of anything but the integrity of our own government and the people who handle this issue.
Okay, thank you. Comment?
Just a quick one, I guess. One of the recommendations we made, and our recommendation also echoed one that had been made actually in 2013 by another audit team within our office looking at multilateral organizations. One of our recommendations focused specifically on the federal government providing additional information to Canadians and to Parliament, who is our client, about what is happening with those funds and what the expectations are in terms of the funds coming back to Canada. And I think that that would go some way, not all the way, but it would go some way towards addressing the point that the speaker just made.
Yeah, Mike Simpson from British Columbia. The thing I'm curious about is the discussion around mitigation versus adaptation in our sector, because it's the elephant in the room, in the sense that the climate change narrative is very apocalyptic, where I remember the graphs in the 1990s, and you would look at them and there's the business's case business as usual case scenario, and it leads to the apocalypse. And we have been on that business as usual case scenario, unable to get off of it. And the discipline in our sector has been to stick to mitigation because we have to stop this. That's the goal. But you know, when you're doing humanitarian work or you're doing work in the developing world, I did a RED project in the Niger Delta. It's a pretty tough project. You're doing climate change in the midst of all this fossil stuff. The people are very poor. The situation is very bad. At what point in our discussions in the sector do we shift the conversation to plan B, which is because right now it's been, let's avoid the Titanic hitting the iceberg of climate change because that's really bad. At some point, we have to say, we're not just hitting the iceberg, we're already hitting it. And this is a big problem because our thinking shifts completely when we start talking plan Bs and strategizing around plan Bs and what this is going to look like. Yeah, so I know. And the problem is there's a psychological tendency. I don't want to talk about that because it's so overwhelming. A 4 times carbon scenario by 2050. But you asked, what does it mean to me? And the problem is at this point, we've already hit 372 parts per million, where last time I looked, it was 387, and you can't reverse that. And there's a 10-year lag. And so even if we take all the cars off the road in Canada today, it doesn't even equal the illegal carbon emissions from illegal flaring in the Niger Delta. And we can't stop that even if we wanted to try to do that right now, like in the time that's necessary. So when you look at it, you kind of go, I don't really want to talk about adaptation, but at what point are we going to talk about the big plan B, and what does it look like, and who's willing to talk about it?
I have very strong views on the viability of a plan B, but I'm going to turn it to Catherine.
Ouais, moi, c'est aussi une question qui me passionne. Et ce que je trouve que la réponse au Canada est extraordinairement pernicieuse. Alors, au niveau domestique, on parle plein d'adaptation. On s'adapte, on a des plans d'adaptation pour les Canadiens, machin, tout ça, c'est important. Mais moralement, c'est pas ça qui est important. Moralement, le Canada, pour moi, doit atténuer. Quand j'étais négociatrice, c'était intéressant parce que la COP avait organisé une session où elle avait invité des philosophes. Il y avait un philosophe de Harvard qui était venu, puis qui nous expliquait la responsabilité. Donc, de dire, quand on émettait, les pays développés émettaient, dans les années 50, sans comprendre les conséquences de ces émissions-là, il n'y avait pas un dommage moral très grand, parce qu'on ne le savait pas. Mais maintenant qu'on sait qu'on fait du mal, on a une responsabilité morale réelle d'atténuation. Et ce qui est pernicieux dans le discours, c'est de dire on va s'adapter domestiquement, mais on va essayer de pousser l'atténuation internationalement. Et c'est un non-sens au niveau éthique. Au niveau éthique, on doit premièrement atténuer au Canada et bien sûr s'adapter parce qu'on a une responsabilité pour les populations du Canada. Et on doit ensuite, premièrement, aider l'adaptation internationalement et sécuriser la qualité de vie de ces gens-là et ensuite les aider, eux, à atténuer. Alors, il y a vraiment c'est extraordinairement perverse actuellement, le discours. Et certainement, quand on est des négociateurs des pays du Sud et qu'on entend les discours des pays développés qui nous disent atténuer, tu leur dis, mais écoute, nettoie ta cour, premièrement, après, tu reviendras me parler. Et en plus, en général, mon expérience, c'est que les pays en voie de développement, si on leur donnait la technologie ou l'opportunité d'atténuer, ils seraient heureux. Là. Venez à Panama, là, aidez-nous avec les systèmes de transport en commun, puis on va applaudir parce que c'est fou comme c'est invivable. Donc, vous avez raison, c'est très important. Et face à l'apocalypse, je pense qu'il faut faire très attention aussi, parce que ce sentiment-là qu'il est presque trop tard, puis il y a une inertie dans le système, ça peut facilement devenir une justification pour l'inaction. Et si on se laisse glisser là-dedans, on va devenir la génération qui a finalement détruit les options d'avenir de nos propres enfants et de nos petits-enfants. Alors, si vous restez dans la prochaine session, je vais être heureuse de parler de ça avec vous.
So we have 10 to 15 minutes left. So, Peter, do you want to touch this? I will. Go for it. Look, I agree with Catherine. I think, you know, the gentleman's right, is that we've been talking about this now for 25 years. But if you go back to the first IPCC report, the nightmare scenario on average temperature increases was 0.5 to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And 1.5 degrees Celsius was supposed to be happening, you know, a century and a half from now. And that was in the upper bound, unimaginable science fiction nightmare scenario. Nobody believes that we're going to hit the 2 degrees Celsius target that the countries have now agreed to. Though the 2 degrees Celsius target is, most are saying, this is a nightmare scenario now, and NASA and the US interagency process last year said, we're looking at now climate increases of, on Fahrenheit, 4 to 5, or a 6 degree Fahrenheit upper bound. And so then the assumption is adaptation, you have enough money, you can grow bananas in Nova Scotia. You can build your way out of it, and you can shield yourself from those impacts. And I think, one, no one knows the impacts, but Catherine and I were in a meeting last week in Montreal. There was a scientist from NOAA, or NASA. They said the epicenter of climate evidence right now on the most revealed climate episode is in Oregon, California. There is no replacement for water. And, you know, La Paz and other countries are looking at having no water within our lifetimes. So this question about saying we're going to throw enough money at adaptation and somehow shield 9 billion people from the impacts of climate change, I think is both from a policy perspective unreasonable. Canada isn't able to do it. We did a report a couple of years ago. I mean, Canada, the federal government's doing lots of really good action with the province, but it's absolutely, the availability is absolutely being outstripped by the demand from city mayors, from communities, from businesses. So I think this, you've hit on this question of the relationship between the two. I don't think it can be an either or. We're moving in areas where we don't now understand how climate impacts are fundamentally disrupting ecosystem links in food chains and acidification of the ocean. Things that are absolutely unimaginable even 20 years ago. I do sound apocalyptic, but I mean, this is based on science. This is what science is saying. So to go back to this session, you know, in terms of what does this mean for development? I mean, I think my sense is this makes your work infinitely more challenging. And there's lots of work that's underway now on nexus-related issues, on food and energy nexus, on water, and I think that's a good sign, and that's where the SDGs are trying to make the linkages. But without overstating it or being overdramatic, I mean, the question is, do we have enough time on this? Oh, please, sorry.
Hi, my name's Robin Ford. 3 very short little tales from Sri Lanka. I've just come back from Sri Lanka where I was working on insurance, which is obviously a critical component of any preparation preparation for disaster risk reduction. First, the last couple of years have been really uncomfortable for the tea industry there. That's their major export. The climate change impact there is less sun, more rain. It's raising some significant concerns. They're a bit like deer in the headlights at the moment. They don't know what's coming and they don't know what to do about it. So tale number 1. Tale number 2, the World Bank, as I became aware while I was there, is working on a project to put in place warehousing for agricultural produce so that the produce can be stored and then sold later, and accordingly the farmers can get higher prices for it. So it's a good thing. But I was looking at, they were showing me the pictures, and so my instant reaction is, oh, but there's no solar on the roof, you know, to provide the electricity. And they said, oh, that never occurred to us. So the little tale there is, come on folks, when you're out there doing your work, take this into consideration where it's appropriate to do so. I think a lot of us are out there not thinking about these issues at all, and we must do so, and we must talk to our colleagues about it so that they do so as well. And finally, I have a Sri Lankan colleague who works in the area of disaster risk reduction and resilience, and he's not paying any attention to mitigation anymore. He's just focusing on disaster risk reduction. Thanks.
Maybe we could take a couple of more comments. So please, sir. Yeah. Okay. So for everybody who wants to make a comment, why don't you stand up? And then, okay, great. So we have three. If you agree, why don't we hear from these three, and then we'll come back to Peter and Catherine. So, please.
Thank you. Less of a comment, but a question, actually. My name is Eric Vogt, the University of Toronto School of the Environment. We heard much about trust, but we also need to talk about commitment. And the question I have is, the UNFCCC had asked countries to make commitments by the end of March with what they intend to do in terms of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. As far as I'm aware, and I may be unaware, but as far as I'm aware, the Canadian government has not yet made its commitments. I wonder if you have any update on where these discussions stand at this point, and if the federal government fails to make any commitments, is there any talk about the provinces going ahead and making their own commitments, like many states elsewhere have done in the absence of a federal government commitment? In that context, I want to hear if you have anything else to say about this particular part of the commitment question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Joy Sen. I'm from India. Just a very short question. I'm wondering if you could add something to our understanding. In India, some of us are trying to get our heads around what is the nature of changes that are taking place and what are the likely impacts. And the one question, one issue that comes up is the issue of the non-linearity of the change that is likely to come. That is coming. That's not likely to come. It's coming already. I haven't heard that term here. I came a few minutes late. Maybe I missed it. I wonder if you could please explicate that, because I think that's a crucial issue in this. That is not linear change. It's not going to be, as far as we understand it. I wonder if you could, and how it's looked at in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please.
Fraser Riley King with CCIC. For the SDGs, the goals and targets are essentially set. A lot of the focus now is on the indicators that are going to be developed for them. Stats Canada is engaging in the process to develop those indicators. And I was just curious to know the extent to which the Office of the Commissioner has been engaged in this, given all of your experience around decades of sustainable development strategies. It may be a very quick answer.
Great. So thank you. With that, we've got four questions, and then I'll ask Catherine and Peter to make some closing remarks as well. So first one is around policy coherence in Sri Lanka. Second is commitments from the federal government and what's happening at the provinces. Third is this question of non-linearity. What do we know that this is going to proceed in an orderly fashion? And then indicators around SDGs. So who wants to go first?
Je pense que je peux donner quelques opinions autour de deux de ces quatre questions-là sur les engagements. C'est vrai, le Canada n'a pas soumis ses engagements. Il faut comprendre pourquoi est-ce qu'on demandait que les engagements soient soumis à la fin mars. Alors, l'idée, c'était de dire, les pays vont dire, moi, je vais faire moins 50, moins 30, moins ci, moins ça. Et là, on peut faire l'addition de ces engagements-là et on peut regarder combien ça nous approche de cette cible d'éviter un réchauffement de plus de 2 degrés. Ça nous permet de mesurer l'augmentation nécessaire d'ambition. Je pense que beaucoup de personnes au Canada, et j'espère à l'extérieur du Canada, comprennent qu'il y a des élections fédérales pour vers le 19 octobre. Et donc, le gouvernement actuel ne sera peut-être pas le gouvernement qui ira à Paris. Et donc, le monde va peut-être devoir attendre pour savoir quelles seront les cibles du Canada et pourront de toute façon faire le calcul avec les cibles actuelles qui sont médiocres du Canada. Et de toute façon, nous savons tous que le Canada devrait faire plus. Je pense que c'est à peu près ça qu'on peut répondre. De comprendre pourquoi on demandait ces cibles-là à l'avance et de comprendre qu'au Canada, on ne saura pas quelles seront nos cibles avant d'avoir élu un nouveau gouvernement, selon moi. Au sujet de la non-linéarité, c'était pas clair pour moi si c'était les perturbations climatiques qui vous inquiétaient. Est-ce que c'est le fait qu'on se dit que les changements climatiques sont non linéaires? Le cas échéant, les scientifiques pensent que si la température augmente trop, ça peut causer, moi en tout cas je comprends principalement 3 grandes perturbations, boucles de rétroalimentation au niveau planétaire. Il y en a une, ça serait le dégel du pergélisol dans l'Arctique, qui émettrait une quantité énorme de méthane, de gaz à effet de serre, et qui accélérerait le réchauffement. Une autre, peut-être, ça serait qu'avec la fonte des glaces des calottes polaires, il y aurait un changement d'albédo. Et l'albédo fait qu'on, finalement, la lumière frappe sur une surface blanche, puis elle est reflétée, tandis que si la surface est foncée, elle est absorbée. Et la troisième, c'est la sécheresse en Amazonie qui causerait une dégradation, une perte, une décomposition des immenses réserves de carbone de cet écosystème-là. N'importe laquelle de ces 3 boucles de rétroalimentation biologique émettrait des quantités de carbone ou changerait tellement les modèles climatiques que là, on devient dans une autre sphère. Et c'est ça, pour ça qu'on parle de non-linéarité et qu'on essaie à tout prix d'éviter. Et donc, on veut rester dans un certain contrôle là, de notre biosphère. Au niveau climatique, c'est ce que je comprends. Mais il y a aussi une non-linéarité dans les réponses, parce que certaines des réponses technologiques, le progrès technologique, c'est souvent quelque chose qui a un bon. Donc, la voiture, qui actuellement est un grand problème au niveau effet de serre au Canada, c'est quand même une technologie du siècle dernier. C'est une vieille technologie, là. C'est une technologie du début du 20e siècle. Et donc, on espère une non-linéarité de réponse, donc on espère des nouvelles technologies, à un moment donné, qui peuvent nous faire sauter ailleurs. On l'a vu dans le domaine des télécommunications, on est passé de la lettre. La lettre est quelque chose qui était centenaire et plus, à Skype, qui est gratuit et instantané. Donc, il y a des non-linéarités de réponse aussi. Donc, il y a des non-linéarités préoccupantes au niveau du régime climatique, mais il peut y avoir des non-linéarités extrêmement importantes et utiles si on favorise l'innovation technologique, je pense.
Peter, last word is over to you.
I guess I would say very quickly that, yes, there is not yet a federal commitment, to my knowledge, for the Paris Convention of Parties. The provinces do have commitments in their own plans. What we were concerned about in our chapter and the report that we did was the fact that these planning processes weren't well integrated and brought together in a way that could provide a sound foundation for developing the kind of carefully thought out target that we believe Canada will need. In terms of the nonlinearities, maybe just very quickly, there are nonlinearities in the ecological systems in terms of the response to climate change. There are nonlinearities in social and economic systems, as Catherine has alluded to, but there are also nonlinearities in political systems that can lead to shifts in policy and hence changes in the approach that's being taken at both the domestic, subnational, and international level. And then the last question then in terms of the CESD's role with respect to indicators. No, we've not been directly involved in commenting on the SDG indicators. We have in the past provided very specific kinds of recommendations to Environment Canada and to the other federal departments about what constitutes a good indicator, what the criteria are that one would apply to design and apply, and then to report against indicators and ensure that sort of continuing accountability.
So, thank you both very much. And one of you, please join me in thanking Catherine and Peter. I think they're very